back, y'all, and today we're talking about water testing. So I have been getting a lot of questions from y'all about water testing, where to start, how to do it, and what exactly it is and how important it is. So I definitely will say that water testing is extremely important in the fish keeping hobby. So today I'm just going to be demonstrating the basics. This is one of my favorite water testing kits. This test, it covers some of the basics, your pH, nitrite, nitrates, and your ammonia levels, which is all really crucial in having a healthy aquarium. Now, of course, there are other types of tests that you can get out there. This is just one of my favorites, which is the API Freshwater Test Kit. This type of test is one of my favorite. There are also strips that you can get, but I do live in a really humid area, and if you get any moisture on those test strips, it basically makes the tests completely useless. And all these types of tests are relatively expensive, so you don't want to buy 100 strips and only be able to use one, and then the rest all have too much moisture on them and you can't use them. So this is one of my favorites, especially for beginners out there in the hobby. It's really simple to use and it will give you a lot of information about where your tank is at. Now, if you are lucky enough to live near a fish store, some of these do offer free water testing, and sometimes they can really help, especially beginners in the hobby, know what they can do to get their water where it actually needs to be. Now, there are other tests available to get a more in-depth picture in your aquarium for when you need to know things like GH and so on. But again, for beginners, this is a great place to start. But like I said, there are other options like the test strips. Those are really nice if you do live in a really dry area and you don't have to worry about moisture leaking into the bottle. So without further ado, I'm gonna open this up and we are going to test some water together. Okay, so I figured I would go over this step by step so that if you are a complete beginner, you will be able to, if you buy this kit or another type of kit, you'll have a really good idea of what you're doing, what you're looking for, and how to do it. So, of course, first things first, we're gonna open up our kit, pull out our drops, and our little test tubes. So of course, first we need to get a sample of our water. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill these tubes real quick in one of my aquariums and I will be right back. So when you are filling these little test tubes, if you have this kit, then you're going to wanna make sure that you fill just to that line of the 5 milliliters. Otherwise, your test results might not be accurate. So the first one I'm gonna go ahead and do is the pH, and we're gonna add 5 drops of this. This is the high range pH test solution. So I'm gonna open up my little bottle and put in 5 drops. And then we're just gonna see, and then we're gonna just see where we match up on our pH. So I don't know how well you can see this because this does also pick up the color chart too, but my pH is about a 7.8, which makes sense because I do live in an area with a lot of hard water problems. And so it makes sense that I would have a higher pH. Okay, so next I'm gonna go ahead and test for my ammonia. And this one is 8 drops, so I'm gonna go ahead and put the 8 drops in. How funny. I don't know if you can see this, but I seem to have like a little water flea or something in here. So now I'm gonna go ahead and add the ammonia solution from the second bottle, which is also 8 drops. Then again, I don't know how well you can see this on camera, but the test is coming up yellow, which means I have no ammonia, which is where you want to be. You don't want ammonia in your fish tank. Ammonia in the smallest amounts can be very dangerous to any of your fish. So now we're gonna go ahead and move on to our nitrite and see where we're at on that. This is add 5 drops. And we're gonna see how we're doing. So if you can see this, it is a definite bright blue color, and that means that I have 0 nitrites in my tank, which makes sense. I actually took this out of my shrimp tank, which is extremely heavily planted. And last but not least, we are going to check our nitrates. So we're going to take our bottle number 1, and that is going to add 10 drops. And this one is what tells me whether or not I really need to do a water change on a tank. And 10 more drops. So once again, this is a bright yellow for my nitrate, and it's showing that I have 0 nitrates, which is actually kind of crazy. I would think that I would have at least a little bit, but again, it's an extremely heavily planted tank. This is coming from my extremely heavily planted shrimp tank, so I guess it's not too surprising. Shrimp don't really have a very large bioload, and then on top of that, there's so many plants in that tank. So depending on what kind of fish you're keeping will depend on what all you need to be testing your water for on the regular basis to make sure that those water parameters are exactly where they need to be for those fish. As I said, this is just the basics. This is covering the basics, and it's a really nice test. It lasts quite a while. Always remember to rinse out your little tubies before putting them back in your kit. You don't want them to be contaminated with old water that might give you a skewed idea of where your water parameters are at. So all my water parameters were right where I want them to be today, which is fantastic. That means that I don't need to do a water change because I didn't even have any nitrates in my tank. I will be adding fertilizer to the tank, but that's pretty much all I have to do. But I do want to give you some tips and things that you can do if your water is not exactly where you want it to be. Now, starting with pH. So with your pH, depending on what species you're keeping in your tank will depend on what pH range you need to have that aquarium in. In my case, I tested my shrimp tank, 7.8. Fantastic. Now, if the pH had been too low, then there are ways that we can remedy that. Or if it's too high, we can remedy that also. There are chemicals that we can add to our tank. Of course, I prefer to go the more natural route, but there are chemicals that you can add, but unfortunately, you're gonna be adding them on a regular basis. But if you go with a more natural route, then that's going to buffer your tank for a lot longer. In the case of if your pH is too high, you can lower that a little bit with adding things that will release tannins. Now, adding something that releases tannins into your aquarium will cause a bit of a yellowish brown tinge to your water. So if you're not okay with that, if you prefer a more sterile environment, I don't recommend going with the natural route. So if you are wanting to go the natural route, you can get pieces of driftwood, or you can add things like Indian almond leaves into the fish tank, which will slowly release tannins into the tank, bringing that pH down a little bit over time. Now, if your pH is too low and you need to raise that pH, things like crushed coral. Crushed coral is going to be your best friend. Crushed coral is also slowly over time going to release things into the water to help kind of buffer your pH in a more positive way. So if you're needing to change your pH, lower it or higher it, that is going to be your best bet. It's going to have a lot longer effect than if you're adding chemicals, because then you're going to have to do it constantly. And not to mention, chemicals are going to cost you a lot more money than if you buy a bag of crushed coral, or if you buy a bag of Indian almond leaves, or add a piece of driftwood that may last years. Next thing up is the ammonia. We don't want ammonia in our tank. We don't want to see ammonia in our tank. If we have already cycled our aquarium and we are seeing an ammonia spike, something is wrong. Something's going on that's wrong. Either we have a bunch of dying plants, or something else passed away in the tank, or we're overfeeding our fish. Somewhere there's a problem. Also, if you're not familiar with what cycling your aquarium is, I have a couple of videos of cycling your tank with fish and without fish that I will put links to in the description box below. We will want to do an immediate water change to get that ammonia back down to 0, but we also want to try to look and see what's going on that is causing that ammonia to spike in the tank. Also, to help prevent ammonia spikes, I recommend not changing your filter media or filter cartridge at the same time that you're doing a water change, because I feel like you're going to be losing way too much bacteria, which could lead to an ammonia spike. Now, the next one is nitrites. We also really don't want to see nitrites in our water. While nitrites are not quite as dangerous to fish as ammonia, it is still not something we want to see in our aquarium, and it can also be a danger to our fish. It can really stress them out. Even as little as 0.25 ppm can actually start wreaking havoc on our tank. It can really stress our fish out. So again, if we're seeing any nitrites in the aquarium, we want to do a water change, try and get that out. And we also once again want to see if there's a problem maybe that we're creating to cause the nitrites to be above 0. And last but not least, we have our nitrates. Now, nitrates is something that we will see in our aquarium. We should probably see nitrates in our aquarium, unless you have an extremely, extremely heavily planted tank where you can barely even see the shrimp that live in there. Now, with our nitrates, we really don't want to see any more than 50 ppm in our aquarium water. That is when you're going to want to make sure that you do your water change. If you see it 50 or higher, you're going to want to do your water change. I would really say if you see anything above 20, you want to go ahead and do your water change. So anyway, guys, that's all I really have for y'all today. As always, thank you so much for watching. I love you guys, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!